At first, she seemed perfect, understanding, calm, deeply empathetic. How could something so secure turn into a relationship that makes you doubt yourself? Why do you start apologizing for things you don't remember doing? And when did you stop recognizing yourself in the mirror? There's something even more disturbing. The most destructive relationships rarely begin with shouting. Stay until the end because understanding this pattern can change how you see love forever. It all started in an almost ideal way. She seemed different from everything before, attentive, sensitive, capable of listening without judging. The connection was intense yet calm, as if you had finally found someone who truly understood you. Conversations flowed, closeness grew fast, and there was a constant sense of emotional security. Nothing seemed out of place. In fact, that is precisely why the change is so hard to detect. It doesn't happen all at once. There isn't a big fight that marks a before and after. The erosion begins in small moments that seem insignificant. Subtle comments, mood swings you can't explain, situations where you end up feeling responsible for something without understanding exactly why. At first, you don't give it much thought. You think it's just stress, that everyone has bad days. But little by little, something starts to change inside you. You start thinking more about your words before speaking, measuring your reactions to avoid conflict, analyzing every conversation afterward, wondering if you said something wrong. Without realizing it, you start walking carefully within the relationship. And yet, you still remember how it was at the beginning. That warm and close version that made you feel chosen. That's why you justify what doesn't fit. Because you believe that if you do things right, everything will go back to how it was before. That is the invisible start of the erosion. It doesn't feel like something serious. It feels like a normal adaptation, like an effort to maintain the relationship. But while you try to adjust your behavior, something more important happens. You start disconnecting from yourself bit by bit, and the most dangerous part is that you still don't see it. Because confusion doesn't appear immediately. It arrives slowly, along with something even heavier: guilt. Confusion doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in bit by bit, almost without you noticing. You start wondering if you're overreacting, if maybe you misinterpreted something, if the real cause of the problem is you. Every conversation ends leaving you with the feeling that you did something wrong, even if you can't point out exactly what. And then guilt appears. You find yourself apologizing more frequently, sometimes for small things, sometimes for situations you don't even fully understand. You do it because you want to regain the calm, because you remember how the relationship was at the beginning, and you believe the problem can be solved if you just try a little harder. But the more you try, the more confusing everything becomes. You start changing small parts of yourself to avoid conflict. You talk less about certain topics. You avoid expressing disagreement. You think twice before reacting. Without realizing it, you start filtering who you are to maintain the emotional stability of the relationship. And that constant adaptation has a cost. The person you used to be, spontaneous, confident, clear with their opinions, begins to fade. You no longer act from naturalness, but from precaution. You look for signs in her tone of voice, in her silences, trying to anticipate potential problems. The hardest part is that you still believe all of this is normal, that all relationships require sacrifice, that maybe you're simply learning to love better. But at some point, a strange feeling appears in front of the mirror. You no longer know exactly where the other person ends and where you begin. And when identity starts to blur, something deeper comes into play. Because often emotional confusion doesn't happen by chance. It arises within a dynamic where emotions are projected silently, and that leads us to the next step of the pattern. Over time, you start to notice something strange. Many conversations end up revolving around how she feels and how you seem to be the cause. If she is sad, you wonder what you did wrong. If she is angry, you try to correct something in yourself. Little by little, the emotional responsibility starts falling on your shoulders. This doesn't always happen consciously. Sometimes it's about emotional projection, internal feelings that are transferred to the other person without anyone clearly noticing. She may feel insecure, frustrated, or hurt by previous experiences, but the conflict appears within the current relationship. And you, trying to maintain harmony, start assuming blame that doesn't always belong to you. There is no shouting. There are no direct accusations. That's why it's so hard to identify. Manipulation isn't always aggressive. Many times it's silent, emotional, almost invisible. It is expressed in phrases that make you doubt your perception, in small comments that question your intentions, in situations where you end up over-explaining yourself to prove you didn't mean any harm. And without realizing it, you enter a cycle. You try to fix something that was never really under your control. You try harder, give more, give in more. You hope that if you manage to show enough understanding, the tension will disappear. But the relief is short-lived, because the problem isn't in a specific action, but in a repeating dynamic. The more you try to save the situation, the more you become the one emotionally responsible. And there, a dangerous role appears, the role of the savior. The idea that if you love enough, you can heal what hurts in the other person. But that role has a high price, because while you try to rescue the relationship, you start losing yourself even more. At some point, the dynamic changes without it being obvious. She begins to appear as someone hurt, misunderstood, someone who simply needs more support. And you, moved by affection and empathy, assume the role of the savior. You want to help. You want to show that you're there. You strive to be more patient, more understanding, more available. Every time a conflict arises, your priority stops being understanding what is happening and becomes calming the situation. And so little by little, the relationship begins to revolve around her emotions. The problem isn't wanting to care for someone. The problem appears when the care becomes a permanent responsibility. When you feel that if you don't do the right thing, everything might break. Without realizing it, you start carrying an emotional weight that doesn't belong to you completely. She may seem vulnerable, but that vulnerability also influences your decisions. It makes you feel like you can't leave, that you can't set clear limits, because doing so would be hurting her. Thus, the dynamic becomes unbalanced. You try to save. She needs to be saved. And while you maintain that role, the relationship holds up, but at the cost of your own stability. The role of the savior is exhausting because it never has a clear end. There is always something more to fix, something more to understand, something more to sacrifice. And the more you invest, the harder it becomes to go back. What seemed like love starts to feel like a constant responsibility, and when the balance breaks like this, something inevitable appears. Deep exhaustion, an emotional burnout that doesn't arrive from one day to the next, but from the silent accumulation of tension, doubts, and continuous efforts. And that exhaustion is the door toward the next phase. Over time, what at first seemed like an intense relationship begins to feel like a cycle of emotional ups and downs. There are very good moments where everything seems perfect again, where you think you've finally found stability. But then another tension arrives, another argument, another moment of confusion, and the cycle starts all over again. That alternation creates something very powerful: emotional dependency. Not because there is necessarily a conscious intention, but because the brain gets used to seeking the moments of calm after the chaos. You start clinging to the good days as proof that everything can improve, justifying the erosion that happens between them. And meanwhile, the exhaustion accumulates. You feel constantly attentive, trying to anticipate mood changes, avoiding situations that can generate conflict. Emotional rest disappears. Even when everything seems calm, a part of you remains alert, waiting for something to change again. That state of permanent tension is more exhausting than an open argument. Little by little, your world begins to revolve around the relationship. Your decisions, your energy, and even your mood depend on how things are between you. Without realizing it, your well-being stops being in your hands. Chaos becomes normal. And the hardest part is that from the inside, you still call it love. Because you remember the intense moments, the deep connections, the implicit promises that everything can go back to how it was at the beginning. But the reality is that each cycle leaves a deeper mark. Your confidence decreases. Your clarity is blurred. You find it hard to distinguish what is truly healthy and what has simply become familiar. And when you reach that point, an even more confusing dynamic appears. You start to doubt your own memories, your perception, what really happened, as if reality became less solid. And that's where something enters that can completely change your way of seeing yourself. In this stage, confusion stops being just emotional and starts to affect your perception of reality. You find yourself remembering conversations in one way, but later you hear another version that makes you doubt. You start wondering if you exaggerated, if you misunderstood, or if things really happened as you think. That is the most dangerous part. There's no need for clear lies or obvious manipulations. Sometimes small repeated phrases are enough. That didn't happen like that. You're being too sensitive. You always interpret everything wrong. Little by little, your confidence in your own judgment weakens. And when you start to distrust yourself, your boundaries also become blurred. What before seemed unacceptable to you, now you justify it. What before you would have pointed out as unfair, now you minimize to avoid conflict. Your internal compass stops guiding you with clarity. Emotional control doesn't feel like control from the outside. It feels like adaptation, as if you were doing what's necessary to maintain peace. But the consequence is that each time you occupy less space within your own life, you start living by reacting instead of choosing, and at some point, a deeply disturbing feeling appears. You no longer know exactly what you want because you've been trying not to bother, not to provoke, not to complicate things for too long. That erosion doesn't happen from one day to the next. It is gradual, silent. That's why it's so hard to recognize while it's happening. However, there comes a moment in which something inside wakes up, a moment of clarity where you see the complete pattern, where you understand that it's not just about one argument or a bad moment, but about a repeated dynamic that has been moving you away from yourself. And that moment marks the beginning of the change. Because recognizing the pattern is the first step to get out of it, change starts in silence. Not with a big argument or a dramatic decision, but with a moment of clarity, a moment in which you observe yourself from the outside and recognize that something doesn't fit, that you've been trying to sustain something that is emptying you for too long. That awakening doesn't mean everything becomes easy immediately. On the contrary, it usually comes accompanied by fear, doubts, and a huge sense of loss. Because recognizing the pattern implies accepting that many things were not as you thought, but it also brings something new, perspective. You start to understand that it wasn't just about what you did right or wrong, that the dynamic was larger than a specific action, that constantly adapting wasn't love, but emotional survival. Recovery begins when you trust your own perception again, when you allow your emotions to exist without constantly questioning them, when you start to rebuild boundaries that before seemed selfish, but are actually necessary. It's not about blaming the other person or turning the story into a war. It's about recovering your center. Little by little, the questions stop being, what did I do wrong? And transform into, what do I need to be okay? The focus shifts from the past to the present, and with time, what seemed like an experience that broke you begins to become a lesson on how to recognize signs before losing yourself again. Because the true end is not the breakup. The true end comes when you regain your identity, your calm, and the ability to choose from clarity. That is when the pattern breaks,